but we're also pub quiz question is to name the only Prime Minister who was assassinated. Spencer Percival, and that's Spencer Percival.
And I don't know why, but I had the impression that he was a kind of nondescript, unsuccessful Prime Minister. But as soon as you start reading about him, that's not the truth at all.
Absolutely, he's a fascinating character. Yeah. And I think in many ways, in contrast to, if you look at a list of Prime Ministers and leading politicians with their various titles, he didn't seek a title. He ended up being the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well as the First Lord of the Chancellery before we had Prime Ministers. And it was sadly more famous for the manner of his departing this world than what he achieved. But he was the guy who was having to raise the funds to support war in the Iberian Peninsula and all the battles raging across Europe.
Yes, and deal with the madness of George III.
Made his name a little bit through that, and just seems like a very hard-working, dedicated lawyer. Didn't seek glory.
He defended Queen Caroline.
Yes.
Who I think people who watch Bridgerton probably know.
So I don't think Bridgerton have actually covered Caroline of Brunswick, the estranged wife of George IV, Queen Charlotte's son. But watch that space. When the relationship with George broke down, Caroline moved to Charlton Vicarage and then to Montague House in Blackheath. Spencer Percival defended her when her neighbour accused her of adultery and of having had an illegitimate child. She had adopted and fostered 8 or so poor local children around this time. He advised Caroline and wrote a letter to George IV, so long they called it the Book. And then Percival acquitted Caroline shortly after returning to power.
His father was something to do with the Navy, and as a child, I think he had grown up in Charlton House, which his father rented. They moved on. The connection was maintained with Charlton House because his older brother struck up a feeling for the eldest daughter of the family who had moved into Charlton House. And that was a good marriage because his older brother was titled Lord Arden. And that was a relationship that the families approved of. Spencer Percival took a shine to the younger sister, which was not a good move because he'd got no prospects whatsoever. He was just a jobbing solicitor.
Wasn't Prime Minister at
He
this
wasn't.
point.
He got no title to inherit. He was just the second son who had to work hard. But perhaps this is a show that he wasn't just Mr. Normal and dull and boring. The story is that, anyway, he eloped with the second daughter, much to everybody's horror. But later as he rose to his fame and fortune or his status in society, it was a marriage that was approved of. And it sounds as though it was a really loving marriage, lots of children.
It's funny, isn't it? You can never really tell what the society approved of and didn't approve of until you see what they forgive.
And why they forgive.
Yes, yeah. He clearly became Prime Minister, so this wasn't a stain.
He did lots of other things along the way. He's quite a normal person. Perish the thought. I think modern comparisons are probably somebody like John Major.
Not a Boris, anyway.
I wouldn't want to get political about this, but okay, not a Boris.
His assassin, John Bellingham, was an odd, intransigent cove. Imprisoned in Russia for dubious reasons, he blamed the local consuls for not helping procure his release. And when he finally made it back to England, he obsessively petitioned a generally disinterested political hegemony. When he lay in wait with a gun in the Houses of Parliament, such a regular lobbyist was he that he raised no suspicions. He dispatched Percival with a single shot and sat nearby to await his fate. Such was the pandemonium, witnesses suggested if he'd not done so, he could have simply strolled away.
When he died, when it came to his estate, he'd got something like £27 in his account. A nation mourned, and there was a collection to provide for his wife and his numerous children. He was allegedly shot by mistake, that the person who, the assassin, the hand of the assassin, I believe, was intending to lie in wait for the Foreign Secretary. And Percival just had the misfortune to be the first person to walk through the door. Bellingham said, yes, I did it. He surrendered himself. And justice being very quick, he was hung within 3 days. Afterwards, people began to ask questions as to, well, why did he do this? He clearly had a lot of grievance against the government. I think he'd been languishing in a prison in Moscow for years. But it was too late to undo the deed. But people had already begun to ask questions about mental health. And interesting, Percival's, of his children, there's a wonderful book by Hugh Galt about his children. And several of them clearly had mental health problems. But others of his children were very active in promoting the welfare of mental health at a time when clearly there wasn't a welfare state. So the idea had begun that people might not just be miserable sinners, that they might act out of reasons of insanity. And in a very small world, from the assassination of him in 1812, literally just round the corner here of the history of St Luke's and Murder Most Foul is the Reverend Arthur Drummond. His brother was a secretary to 4 prime ministers and finally the secretary to Robert Peel, and was mistaken for Peel and was assassinated.
So, so just so I understand this is someone who wasn't the Prime Minister but was mistaken for a Prime Minister and was shot. And he's also here.
He's the brother of Arthur Drummond.
Edward Drummond was walking down Whitehall on his way to Downing Street. Daniel Macnaghten came from behind and fired his pistol at point-blank range. Drummond was probably not fatally wounded, but the botched medical practice and bloodletting of the time caused complications. He died 5 days later.
And the outrage was tempered by the realising that the man who'd assassinated his brother was clearly unwell, and he was the very first person ever to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. And now we have the Macnaghten rules, because the assassin, Macnaghten, ended up in Bedlam and then to Broadmoor when it first opened. So by tragic coincidence, we have just below the statue of Percival is actually where Percival is interred in the vault, and in another vault at the other end of the building, in the rector's vault, is the brother of Arthur Drummond. So we have 2 unfortunate victims of assassination, which are both landmarks in our history.
And the second one in particular, a key turning point in the way we treated mental health.
We do, and legislation, and the Macnaghten rules go around the world. That's the basis on which people might be deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. And hopefully we have a better understanding of why people might commit murder most foul.
That's an extraordinary coincidence.
It is. It's just an amazing connection that we have here.
We know it's not your fault, 'cause some die in a blunder, or are shot when they're caught. A tombstone which you live on, though really not that long. The universe is heated, will long outlive